Some of you know that before coming to St. Mary's, I was the upper school chaplain at St. Christopher's School. And when I was there, one of my favorite classes to teach, and by the way, I had never been a classroom teacher before this experience, was a senior religion elective called God's Call and Our Response, which was basically a vocational discernment class for boys in the final year of their high school experience. And I have to tell you, I always felt a lot of sympathy for the boys in this class that I was teaching. Because they were taking AP classes, they were applying to college, they were playing sports, they were trying to put resumes, and believe it or not, I actually got friend requests from some of them who had already set up LinkedIn pages and 17 and 18 years old. These boys were living under an enormous amount of pressure to succeed. And everywhere they turned, someone was asking them some version of the same questions. What are you going to do with your life? Where will you excel? How are you going to become successful? Parents asked it out of love. Teachers asked it again out of love. College admissions offices asked it out of love. The culture was constantly asking those questions. And then, at 2:45 on a Friday, when they were sitting in my classroom, they had to sit there and hear me ask them a completely different question. Not what do your parents want you to do? Not what looks impressive on an application. Not what will make you the most money. But what is God calling you to do? What is God calling you to do? And that is a much harder question. Because it requires us to learn how to discern, to separate all the voices that influence us long enough to pay attention to the voice of God speaking to their own hearts. Hard to do at 2:45 in a sweaty classroom with a bunch of boys on a Friday afternoon. But nevertheless. And the truth is that it's not only 17-year-old boys or 18-year-old boys who struggle with that question. What is God calling me to do? Adults do it too. Sometimes we get swept along by expectations. Sometimes we end up in places we never imagined or planned to be. It's not always bad. Sometimes illness or grief, family responsibilities, life's challenges and disappointments force us down roads and paths that we never imagined for ourselves. And yet, the question still remains. What is God calling me to do in this season of life? Whatever it is. And that's the question that's hiding underneath today's gospel reading about John. John the Baptist has just been born. The neighbors are celebrating. The family's gathered. And Luke tells us that everyone is asking, what then will this child become? And it's a wonderful question. It's an important question. What will John become? A leader? A scholar? A priest? But then something unexpected happens. Zechariah finally recovers his voice after 9 months of not being able to talk. And when he begins to speak, he doesn't spend much time talking about John at all until the end. And instead, he praises God. He speaks about God's faithfulness, God's promises, God's salvation, and only towards the end does he turn to his son. And he says, and you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways. So in other words, John's life only makes sense within the larger story of what God is doing. His vocation is not to become the center of the story. His calling is to help people prepare for Christ and to help people see Christ. And somehow that becomes the source of his joy. And that's an important word that I want us to focus on. Sometimes we can confuse happiness and joy. This morning I woke up at 6:30. It was cool outside. I had a cup of coffee. The boys were still sleeping. My wife, who I love dearly, was still sleeping. And I was happy. It was a really great moment. Happiness is a gift. It comes in those kind of beautiful moments. Family gatherings, a good meal, a piece of good news that we've been hoping to hear. But joy runs deeper. Joy is something else. Theologian Frederick Buechner wrote that vocation, or calling, is the place where our deep gladness or our joy and the world's deep hunger meet, or the world's deep needs. Joy is what happens when we discover that our lives are participating in God's purposes, in God's mission. John found that place, not because his life was easy, not because he was necessarily comfortable, not because he was successful in the way the world measures success. For goodness sakes, he lived out in the wild, he wore camel hair, he ate locusts and wild honey. He found joy because he knew who he was and whose he was. And I think that's something that's really important for us to remember here at Healing Service. There are seasons when our calling is to serve others. There are seasons when our calling is to receive help and healing from others. And that's what we do here Wednesday after Wednesday. There are seasons of building, seasons of waiting, seasons of strength, seasons of weakness, seasons of certainty, seasons of doubt, seasons of grief. But God's call does not disappear when our circumstances change. It's always there. And oftentimes it's the pathway to healing. The church asks a different question than the world asks. Not simply, what are you going to do? But how is God inviting you to participate in his work, his mission, and his purpose in this particular season of your life? Because that is where life-giving joy begins. Not in becoming the center of the story, but in discovering that, like John, we have a place in God's story. And that God's purposes are larger, deeper, and more beautiful